Well, a bill proposed in Lansing would ban Islamic law known as Shariah Law here in Michigan. A state lawmaker says it's aimed at protecting women and children, but Muslim advocates say it would violate religious freedom. 7 investigator Jonathan Carlson joins us live now with much more on this debate. Jonathan.
Carolyn, good evening. She tells me she has a number of co-sponsors and other lawmakers who say they'll support the bill. State Representative Michelle Hoitenga of Wexford County proposing a bill that would ban Michiganders from using a foreign country's laws in the courtroom, Shariah law included, a cornerstone of the Islamic tradition.
We believe that the proposed bill is not only anti-Islam but unnecessary.
The Council on American Islamic Relations weighed in.
We have the Establishment Clause of the Constitution that no one religion can be singled out. The law of the land is the Constitution, not any foreign law trumping.
The bill appears to be in response to a Detroit doctor who was recently charged with running a clinic engaged in genital mutilation, what some say is an extreme form of Shariah law. A handful of Democrats at the State House are joining area Muslims in opposition, saying linking the doctor and alleged crimes and Shariah law are a stretch, and they worry it'll limit religious freedoms. Hoitenga talked to Action News by phone.
I just want to make sure that we're abiding by all federal and state laws and send a message that inhumane actions against women and children just won't be tolerated in Michigan.
10 other states have done this. A number of others are considering it. We're live in the Metro tonight. I'm Jonathan Carlson, 7 Action News.
All right.
Please raise your hand if you heard about that news story when it came out about a year and a half ago. Okay, about a third of you. Now, how many of you heard that about a month and a half ago, a district judge in Michigan dropped the charges and declared that a federal law banning FGM is unconstitutional? About 10 days later, the Fed said they would appeal the decision. The judge who dismissed the charges said that the power to outlaw FGM should be left up to the individual states. Therefore, this judge just threw out the U.S. Code, which declares that female circumcision or cutting is a federal crime punishable by 5 years in prison. So what is female genital mutilation? Well, there are the different types that are practiced throughout the world, but they all involve shaving or actually cutting off different areas of the female genitals, which can even include sewing it shut. It's heartbreaking to see the reactions of the girls who are forced to experience this. Thankfully, over half of the U.S. states have banned FGM, and a growing list of states are also banning foreign and international law as a whole. These 11 states prohibit the use of foreign law in their state courts. At the same time, these 16 states have proposed legislation which, if passed, would ultimately prohibit the use of foreign law in their state courts as well. At the same time, there are a number of people who say that no one needs to be concerned about the practice of foreign law in America. No one needs to be concerned about female circumcision, and no one needs to be concerned about Sharia. After all, Linda Sarsour said Sharia law is reasonable, and once you read into the details, it makes a lot of sense. People just know the basics. She also tweeted, "You'll know when you're living under Sharia law if suddenly all your loans and credit cards become interest-free. Sounds nice, doesn't it?" Tax-free loans and credit cards does sound nice, but I wouldn't want to live under Sharia in order to get them. Here's why. Sharia is an Arabic word meaning path or way. Islam is a religion that is defined not merely by orthodoxy, right belief, but also, even more so, orthopraxy, or right practice. Therefore, a central part of Islam is its legalistic, detailed system of law. Sharia, which encompasses all aspects of life, including both rituals and social relations. As for the former, Sharia covers purity, prayer, alms, and fasting, just to name a few. And as for the latter, Sharia covers criminal law, family law, including marriage, divorce, and inheritance, economic law, including trade, commerce, and contracts, and the list goes on. In order to have a better understanding of Sharia, I have to take you back to the 7th century AD to a different part of the world, specifically to what we now know as Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. We have to go there because that is where the founder of Islam was born and raised. According to tradition, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in AD 570 in the town of Mecca. Mecca was a polytheistic society, and that time period is referred to as the Age of Ignorance, also known as Jahiliyyah. In 595, when he was 25 years old, Muhammad married a wealthy 40-year-old widow named Khadijah. 15 years later, in 610, when he was 40 years old, while praying and meditating in a cave near Mecca, Muhammad had what was believed to have been a visitation from the angel Gabriel. He gave Muhammad the first of many revelations that he would receive over the next 22 years of his life. All those revelations combined in the form of a book is what is now known as the Quran, which contains 114 chapters. However, it's believed that Muhammad received a little bit at a time on an as-needed basis. That particular night in the cave, Muhammad received what is now known as chapter 96 of the Quran. 2 years later, in 612, Muhammad began to preach a message of monotheism, that there was only one God, and that people should submit to him because the day of judgment was coming. So Muhammad peacefully invited people to Islam. Over the next 10 years of preaching and inviting, Muhammad had very few followers, and in the latter time period, both Muhammad's wife and uncle had died, and therefore he lost his money and his protection. By 622, Muhammad had angered the local leaders, and when he heard that there was an assassination plot on his life, Muhammad fled from Mecca to Yathrib, now known as Medina. This migration to Medina was a very important event in Islamic history because it marked the beginning of the Islamic calendar. That is why whenever you read about an event from an Islamic perspective, along with the number of the year, it will say AH rather than AD. So this event, which happened in AD 622, is referred to as 1AH, according to a Muslim or an Islamic source. Now, when Muhammad fled to Medina, he was initially welcomed by the Jews in that area. Knowing the polytheism of Mecca, the Jews welcomed Muhammad's monotheistic belief. And as time went on, he continued to receive more revelations and more followers. However, the revelations began to get longer, more detailed, and more aggressive. Unfortunately for Muhammad, the more details he shared with them, the more the Jews began to realize that God he was talking about was sounding less and less like the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Eventually, the Jews rejected Muhammad, and that's when Muhammad rejected the Jews. Some of his earlier revelations and commands to his followers were abrogated or replaced by new revelations and new commands. Muhammad arrived in Medina as a refugee, but when he left Medina, he was a religious leader, a military leader, and a political leader, because he established and led the first Islamic state. In a 7-year period between 623 and 630, Muhammad was personally involved in 27 battles or military campaigns, and he sent his followers out on roughly double that. And it was in 630 when Muhammad and his followers went back to Mecca and conquered it. In chapter 9 of the Quran, we can read part of Muhammad's final marching orders to his followers. Fight against those who believe not in Allah nor in the last day, nor forbid that which has been forbidden by Allah and his messenger, and those who acknowledge not the religion of truth among the people of the scripture, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Then in 632, Muhammad died. When he was alive, Muhammad never told his followers who he wanted his successor to be. The events that followed turned into a major dispute which caused the Sunni-Shia split. However, each successor followed Muhammad's final marching orders. And here you can see the spread of Islam from AD 622 through 750. The dark orange shows the territory of the Islamic world from 622 to 632 under Muhammad himself. The light orange shows the territory added between 632 and 661 by the first 4 caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali. The green areas show the territory added by the Umayyad caliphs from 661 to 750. The purple areas are the non-Islamic kingdoms, and the brown lines with arrows signify the directions of Islamic military campaigns. To find the most authoritative information about Muhammad and the origin of Islam, we need to look to some primary and secondary sources. According to roughly 88%, 90% of Muslims in the world who are Sunni, the belief is that both Allah and the Quran are eternal, and that bits and pieces of the Quran were sent down to Muhammad through Gabriel, and Muhammad never had any direct interaction with Allah. Everything was through Gabriel, and over all these years of revelations, all of that compiled into the form of a book, or a finite Quran. That's what we call it today. We also have the Sirah literature, and these are the biographies of Muhammad. These are 4 of the earliest ones available. But in addition to the biographies of Muhammad, we also have the Hadith. These are the things that Muhammad said and did and approved of. Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim are 2 of the most popular. So the Sirah, the biographies of Muhammad, plus the things that Muhammad said, this is known as the Sunnah, the lifestyle example of Muhammad himself. Now, in addition to these sources, we also have the Taqrī. This is the history. This right here is volume 1 of a 39-volume set by Al-Tabari, which covers from the time of Adam and Eve all the way through Islamic expansion. We have tafsirs. These are the commentaries on the Quran, kind of like a study Bible, per se. This one right here is a 10-volume set by Ibn Kathir, probably one of the most popular ones. Now, the most important thing I want you to remember here is that when you take the Quran, which is supposedly the eternal word of Allah, and you combine that with the Sunnah, which again is the combination of the Sirah and the Hadith, this is how Sharia is derived. There are 4 major schools of Islamic jurisprudence, Sunni schools, the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali schools of Islamic law.
Wait, how is Sharia, will you say that again? How is Sharia derived?
By taking the Quran and the Sunnah.
Thank you.
Now, this timeline here, these are the year of death of all the different authors of those sources that you just saw. You have historians, jurists, of course, Hadith collectors, 200 years after Muhammad. You see there the Ibn Ishaq, 767, almost 150 years after Muhammad, as the earliest biography. Now, the Ibn Kathir set, which is one of the most revered by Sunnis, that's even later. He died in 1373. So as you can see, many late sources here. That's, of course, when you compare it to biblical manuscripts and all of that. So when it comes to Sharia, we need to understand some foundational terms. In a sense, the traditional view does not allow for any development in Sharia. It is supposed to be God-given and fixed in the text of the Quran and Hadith, which establish the basic principles of law. The process of discussion, systematic juristic thinking, and implementation is fiqh, which is the human endeavor to rightly interpret and apply God's perfect law. However, it is sanctified by the consensus of the community, which is inerrant. In this sense, the whole of Sharia, as accepted by the orthodox legal schools of Islam, is seen as God's divine law, perfect, untouchable, and unchangeable. At first, scholars and jurists created rules from the source texts through the device of independent reasoning, with the Sunnah serving as the interpretive framework to the Quran. However, independent reasoning was later rejected by most and replaced by logical deductions and by ijma'. Ijtihad, a striving to understand and apply the Quran and Sunnah to situations not directly addressed in the sources, was used by the early Sunni jurists, but declined by the 10th century when most Sunni scholars considered the codex complete and in no further need of development. Following that decision, imitation or blind following of previous legal procedures and decisions was the only method used in making new decisions until the modern age. In other words, around 1100 years ago, Sunni Muslims closed the gates of ijtihad. Although Shias are very small in number compared to the amount of Sunnis in the world, Shia law does still cover a sizable area in the East. Areas that follow the Shia schools are represented by the yellow, orange, brown, and red-colored areas. The Jafari school is by far the largest of the Shia schools, and it is dominant among the 12er Shiites all over the Muslim world, especially in Iran and about 1/3 of Iraq, parts of Lebanon and the Arabian Peninsula, as well as small parts of India and Southeast Asia. Now, as far as the Sunni schools, in the upper part of the list, we have the Hanafi. That is the dark, or not dark green, but kind of green, before we go to the darker green one. So, the Hanafi, that was developed in Iraq. It was the official school of the Abbasid and Ottoman empires. Today, over 30% of all Muslims follow it, and it is dominant in Turkey, Syria, the Balkans, Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Western Egypt, India, and most of Russia's Muslim community. This is also said to be the most lenient and flexible school of law. Interestingly, this school also emphasizes speculative opinion over hadith. The Hanbali school, which is the dark green, this is the most strict school of law. 95% of Saudi Arabia follows this school, about 1/2 of the UAE, a small part of Oman and Qatar. Almost all Salafis follow the Hanbali school. Now, in this school, hadith are preferred over personal reasoning. So that's more of a just blind following, just do what it says. The Maliki school was founded in Medina. It is dominant in North and West Africa from Mauritania to Egypt, and also in Kuwait and Bahrain, part of the UAE, and a very small part of Saudi Arabia. The Shafi'i school, dominant in Yemen, East Africa, Eastern Egypt, about 1/3 of Iraq, a small chunk of Turkey, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, and the Philippines. This Shafi'i school proclaimed the supremacy of Sunnah over the Quran in legal matters. It was also developed in Cairo, Egypt, and it was the first codified school of law. Now, even though there are many countries that implement Sharia, there are differences in how much Sharia is implemented in those different countries. For example, the green areas on this map are Muslim majority countries and members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, where Sharia plays no role in the judicial system. The yellow areas are countries where Sharia applies in personal status issues, such as marriage, divorce, inheritance, and child custody. But otherwise, they have a secular legal system. The purple areas are countries where Sharia applies in full, covering personal status issues as well as criminal proceedings. And finally, the orange areas are countries with regional variations in the application of Sharia. Saudi Arabia, as you can see, is one of the large purple areas that are under full Sharia, which means that in Saudi Arabia, Sharia is the constitution. Here's the official flag of Saudi Arabia. The flag is green because that was Muhammad's favorite color. The Shahada is at the top of the flag, La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, which means there's no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God.
No, that's not right.
And then, of course, there is a sword at the bottom to represent the religion of peace. After this, Article 1 of the Saudi Constitution says, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is a sovereign Arab Islamic state with Islam as its religion. God's book, the Quran, and the Sunnah of his prophet are its constitution. Here's a pretty famous picture of a women's rights conference in Saudi Arabia. You can probably, if you can't tell, there are no women there. And believe it or not, about 1.5 years ago, Saudi Arabia, or I should say, the UN elected Saudi Arabia to the Women's Rights Commission for the 2018 to 2022 term. Hillel Neuer, the executive director of UN Watch, said, electing Saudi Arabia to protect women's rights is like making an arsonist into the town fire chief. It's absurd. Now, one of the differences among the schools of law is the punishment for any particular crime. Here, for example, we have homosexuality. Under the Hanafi school, the punishment is up to the ruler. Under the Shafi'i, 100 lashes, or some say, or stoned to death. And the Maliki, Hanbali, and Jafri schools say it is death. Now, although there are minor differences among the schools, all of them are in agreement that the highest authority for law in Islam is the Quran. A perfect example of the reality of these punishments is this news story. This one happened to be in May of 2017, but if you keep up on news in the Muslim world, you see different stories like this frequently. Indonesia's Aceh, 2 gay men sentenced to 85 lashes. Now, Indonesia is the country in the world with more Muslims than anywhere else, but it's only the most northwestern part of Indonesia, Aceh, that is where Sharia is implemented the most out of all of Indonesia. A lot of Indonesia, there are many moderate Muslims. And of course, when you have Islam going to areas where they were very animistic, believing that everything pretty much has a soul, and you mix that with Islam, you're going to have a little bit different flavor of Islam than you're going to have where it originated in Saudi Arabia, or we now know as Saudi Arabia. Now, there are also punishments for blasphemy as well. So if you criticize Islam, the Quran, or Muhammad, you can be punished in a number of ways. This map here, the dark red is death. The lighter red is prison. Orange, you can get fined in those countries. Yellow, which you can see here, Australia, there are restrictions on speech. And there is technically a punishment in the gray area, which is a lot of places currently. Anyone know what the punishment is there in the gray areas? Yeah, you said you call it racist. Yeah, either or intolerant, racist, bigot, Islamophobe. One of the two, right? So name calling is the current punishment when you're not living under Sharia to any degree. Because what's the best thing they can do is just have you quit talking, right? Have you quit sharing, have you quit educating people and all of that. So Sharia deals with all aspects of daily life, including politics, economics, banking, business law, contract law, marriage, divorce, child rearing and custody, sexuality, sin, crime, and social issues. There's absolutely no separation between mosque and state. When a person converts to Islam, they are not only submitting to a religion, they're also submitting to a political system, or in other words, an Islamic state. Therefore, when a person leaves Islam, they're also committing treason. A country under full Sharia, and there aren't many out of all those different countries that you saw, because again, the Sharia is implemented in different ways, in different respects. But a country under full Sharia denies freedom of speech, the equality and rights of women, the rights of non-Muslims, freedom of thought, freedom for artistic expression. Non-Muslims cannot bear arms, democracy, any laws other than Sharia, any change of laws, and also freedom of the press. In cases of divorce, any children over the age of 7 years old automatically goes to the man. In cases of divorce, as a result of the apostasy of either the husband or the wife, the children automatically go to the Muslim. So what are some of the punishments under Sharia? Now, if we compare that to here in America, you leave Islam under Sharia, you have 3 days to repent or death. In America, of course, we have freedom of religion. You can join or leave whatever religion you want to join or leave. Adultery ranges from beating with 100 lashes to being stoned to death. In America, there's no punishment for that. And of course, this is completely separate from what we find in the Bible of sin and what is not sin, of course. But this is just under the law codes themselves, publicly. Alcohol, under Sharia, beating with 40 to 80 lashes. Of course, alcohol is completely legal here in the West. Stealing, right hand cut off at the wrist. That one, of course, jail or fines in America, Western countries. Slander, lying or hurting reputation, could be beating with 80 lashes. If it is a slander that is punishable in the West, you can't have jail or fines for that. And also murder. Now this one is, of course, the closest. You could be punished under either system, under Sharia and also in the West. But under Sharia, the murder does not apply to Muslims who murder a non-Muslim, or a woman, or a slave. And of course, in the West, there's jail and even perhaps execution for being a murderer. If a woman claims that she's been raped, she has to provide 4 male witnesses. If she cannot do that, she's usually accused of adultery, which again ranges from beating with 100 lashes to being stoned to death. So as you can tell, the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights are not compatible with Islamic law. That's why every now and then, at the end of the day, political Islamists have to just come out and clearly admit
our job is to change the Constitution of America.
Now that was 13 years ago, and you actually had to be at this meeting in order to hear it. So now let's go back 30 years ago to 1989.
Education is one of the most important areas that Muslims have to address. And while our objective, our final objective, is not just to become part of the system that we experience now, that we see, our objective, our final objective, is to create our own Islamic systems, and not only create Islamic systems for Muslims, but to look at all the other people who are sharing this country with us as potential Muslims. And if we look at them as potential Muslims and feel that we have the obligation, which Allah has told us, to try to bring them into the same style of thinking, into the same way of behaving, into the same objectives that we have, then we have to have some way that we can communicate with them and some way we can work with them. And in that long-range process of making America Muslim, all of America Muslim, then we have to have some actual short-range goals. We have to have some way of dealing with them and know how we're going to deal with them and in which ways, and be very calculated about it, or else we will not accomplish our goals.
So why do they have these goals? Well, the early Islamic jurists who created the schools of law also divided the world into 2 major houses or abodes. These 2 major divisions of the world are known as Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. Early jurists devised these terms to denote legal rulings for ongoing Muslim conquests after the time of Muhammad. In other words, the abode of Islam is areas of the world that are under Sharia, and the abode of war is areas of the world that are not under Sharia. Michael Nazir Ali said, "It has traditionally been interpreted as the duty of all Muslims to wage war until all infidels have been subdued and Islam is victorious. Jihad in these terms is unfinished until the latter has been transformed into the former." Not surprisingly, Islam continued to spread. And the caliphate that Muhammad established continued throughout the centuries all the way into the time of the Ottoman Empire, which was on a steady decline from the late 1600s to 1923. Now, whereas the colors in the previous map I showed you display the areas Islam spread to, the colors in this map show which areas were lost by the Ottoman Empire. And you can see that in 1923, the empire was down to just a fraction of what it once was. Then in 1924, the caliphate was abolished. Under Western colonial rule, Islamic law was gradually phased out in some Islamic countries with only certain aspects of Sharia staying in place, and it usually had to do with family law. Another contemporary issue surrounds the extent to which Muslim minorities in non-Muslim countries are obliged to keep Sharia, especially when Sharia is in conflict with the Western laws they live under. Muslims in the West can avoid conflict between Sharia and their Western home by following a principle called darura, or necessity, which states that when emergency circumstances threaten the life and welfare of Muslims, the unlawful may become lawful, and this allows those Muslims to obey Western legal systems and Western governments. Also, maslaha public good states that certain Sharia rules may be modified when imperative or expedient for the welfare of the public. Some scholars say that Muslims can freely live in the West and obey Western laws if the West grants them entrance, guarantees them safety, and grants them the free practice of Islam. However, most traditional, fundamental, and devout Muslims say that these principles are not permanent and are simply temporary tools to justify living in non-Muslim societies during the times of weakness and subjugation when Muslims are the minority. The latter mindset, which I just described, was the kind held by some contemporary figures, one of whom was Hassan al-Banna, a young 22-year-old who in 1928 established a group called the Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, more commonly known as the Muslim Brotherhood. In 1938, at their 10th anniversary commemoration meeting, al-Banna said, "It is our conviction that the rulings and precepts of Islam are comprehensive and organize the affairs of this life and the next. Whoever believes that those precepts are only concerned with worship and spirituality is mistaken. Islam is creed and worship, country and nationality, religion and government, action and spirituality, book and sword." Their motto became, "Allah is our goal, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest aspiration." Al-Banna's ambition was to create a global Islamic superstate, instituting Sharia as a universal law. He said, "It is a duty incumbent on every Muslim to struggle towards the aim of making every people Muslim and the whole world Islamic, so that the banner of Islam can flutter over the earth and the call of the muezzin can resound in all the corners of the world. God is greater." Al-Banna also said, "It is the nature of Islam to dominate, not to be dominated, to impose its laws on all nations and extend its power to the entire planet." To learn much more about the Muslim Brotherhood, just go to my Vimeo channel, and on the upper left, you will see the Muslim Brotherhood, Origin, Identity, and Agenda. And also, this presentation, or at least a Central California edition of it, is on that channel as well, which is pretty close to this presentation that you're hearing today, although today there's a few updates, of course. And that's vimeo.com/Tony Gurule. Now let's move on to what is currently happening in the West. Many people are still not aware of the continued Islamization of Europe. And there are now over 80 Sharia courts. There are also Sharia-controlled, people called no-go zones, which are patrolled by Muslims who enforce Sharia in these neighborhoods. Interestingly, despite all of the years of criticizing Christianity and the God of the Bible, which is what brought him most of his fame, Professor Richard Dawkins said more recently, "I have mixed feelings about the decline of Christianity insofar as Christianity might be a bulwark against something worse." Since he's from the UK, he has probably realized how the growth of Islam, especially over the last few decades, has changed the UK's societies and political environment. We as Americans need to look to the UK and much of Europe and realize that we can either learn from their mistakes or we're going to follow in their footsteps. If you're unaware of the Islamization that has taken place across the pond, watch the show I did with Tommy Robinson called The Islamization of the United Kingdom. Speaking of the United Kingdom, can anyone guess how often a case of female genital mutilation is reported in England? Anyone?
Not very often.
Every 2 hours.
Every 2 hours.
Over 5,000 new FGM cases in England last year, still no prosecutions. Now, you've heard people say, oh, this is just a North African thing. This is a cultural thing. It is true that there are countries in Africa where more than 90% of girls face female genital mutilation. If you look at this map here, you can see the percentage of females who go through FGM. Now, also too, female circumcision is what's actually talked about. It's just that it many times results in what's known as FGM, or female genital mutilation. Egypt, 91%. Sudan, 88%. Somalia, 98%. Mali, 89%. And there, of course, you can see all the other percentages for the other countries. But how about Indonesia, where 49%, from 0 to 11 years old, so birth to 11, have undergone FGM, or circumcision. So it's not just an African thing, as some people claim. In fact, in 1981, Sheikh Gad al-Haq of Al-Azhar University, a supreme authority in Sunni Islam, issued a fatwa stating that circumcision of girls was a religious obligation. This is in the Maliki school, which you saw earlier in that map, and how that came. And here it talks about, I'm not going to quote the whole thing here. The Prophet used to say, when the circumcised part touches the circumcised part, ghusl is obligatory. Then, of course, the very next passage there as well. Now, this is of the Maliki school of law. This is the Shafi'i. How many of you heard about the book Reliance of the Traveler? That's the Shafi'i school. Now, it says here, circumcision is obligatory for both men and women. For men, it consists of removing the prepuce from the penis, and for women, removing the prepuce of the clitoris, not the clitoris itself, as some mistakenly assert. Hanbalis hold that circumcision of women is not obligatory, but sunnah, while Hanafis consider it a mere courtesy to the husband. However, the Arabic to the right actually says, circumcision is obligatory for every male and female by cutting off the piece of skin on the glands of the penis of the male, but circumcision of the female is by cutting out the clitoris. So what is the Islamic justification for this? Well, this Fairfax County, Virginia imam said it prevents girls from becoming hypersexually active. The Islamization of Canada was a show I did with Sandra Solomon. She grew up in Saudi Arabia but now lives in Canada. She talks about the changes that have taken place in Canada since she has been there. And we talked about M103, which was in the news a while back, and that was voted on in Canada near the end of March in 2017, I believe. In regards, or 2016. In regards to M103, conservative MP Garnet Gunua said, the word Islamophobia can be used to mean both discrimination against Muslims and criticism of Islamic doctrine or practice. It is important that we not conflate the two. Religious people deserve legal protection, but religions do not. People should not discriminate against individuals, but should feel quite free to criticize the doctrine, history, or practice of any religion. Now, despite this insight and common sense statement, this bill actually passed by a vote of 201 for and 91 against. And sadly for Canada, yet no surprise whatsoever, shortly after that, the Toronto Sun website said M103 talks turns to prosecution and censorship. And that's the way it's going to go everywhere. If you start with this whole don't offend and all of that stuff. So Canada basically just moved one step closer to full Sharia. And they did it all on their own. Here's something that every individual in every country's leadership needs to realize. When you restrict freedom of speech, which includes freedom to offend others, freedom to critique and criticize ideas, religions, and worldviews you don't agree with, etc., you are merely implementing aspects of Sharia upon yourself, and your country moves one step closer to Sharia compliance. As you can see, the USA is still on the far left of the freedom of speech scale. However, recently there has been a significant increase in ad hominem attacks and name-calling when you say something that other people don't like. But after all, speech that people don't like is the exact kind of speech that was meant to be protected by the First Amendment. So what are some of the tactics that are currently being used in America with the intent to move us towards Sharia compliance? OIC chief said freedom of speech doesn't allow insulting Islam. What is the OIC? It's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, a body of 56 nations plus the Palestinian Authority that has constituted the largest voting bloc at the United Nations since the demise of the Soviet Union. House Democrats moved to criminalize criticism of Islam. The OIC wants Sharia-compliant laws for the entire world, and it has been working for years to compel the United Nations to criminalize Islamophobia. At the same time, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is hard at work in America, despite the fact that it was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation terrorism trial for funding Hamas. So is CARE's agenda being implemented in your area? Here is their ways that they encourage mosques, Islamic centers, and so on to get involved. Now, when I gave this talk in Central California, which the video is on my Vimeo channel, I went through each of these, went to the Facebook pages of an Islamic center and mosque in that area, actually had screenshots of all the events that fall under these categories. I told you how many times they've done all of these things. Now, I attempted to do that for Southern California, but there are so many, of course, mosques and Islamic centers, and if you just go to their Facebook pages, because a lot of them have them, you will compare this list to the events that they're having. And you'll notice that all these things are taking place. Now, the methodology of Dawah, this book was published in 1989, and it's not surprising that many of CARE's tactics fall in line with those taught in this book. It contains part of the strategy on how to make the message of Islam acceptable to the West. Part of the strategy includes, think about things you've seen in the newspapers, building relationships with the community through service to humanity outreach activities and programs in order to gain recognition and favor from the community and political leaders. Part of the strategy on how to make the message of Islam acceptable to the West is social justice, rendering useful services, visiting schools, connecting with the media. Yes, they will build relationships with people from all political parties, government officials, military leaders, members of law enforcement, and religious leaders. And they will take advantage of any opportunity that is given to them. They also make an effort to participate in interfaith dialogues or panel discussions, where all of the non-Muslim panelists are usually ignorant of Islamic history and theology. With all these tactics in place, they believe the Islamization of the West is possible through dawah alone. Think of dawah as cultural jihad, or civilization jihad, where swords are not necessary. By the way, it's very hard to find this book online anywhere. But if you go to a search engine, type in methodology of Dawah PDF, it'll probably come right up. So you can get the PDF, no problem. It's not surprising though, because just as this ad from Dearborn, Michigan says, don't forget that Dawah works on the same principles as that of advertisement. Bulk and repeated exposure creates acceptance. So this whole agenda is being implemented under the veil of freedom of speech in pluralistic coexistence. But ultimately, Islam doesn't want to coexist. It wants to set the agenda. They're doing this under the veil of political correctness. And when a person questions any of their tactics, they begin to say they are offended or being oppressed. However, in America, there's no right to not be offended. Now, even though we have these American rights, they will attempt to use our own laws and liberties and freedoms against us. And when we are informed and or we bring this information to other people's attention, there's an attempt to shut us up by calling us names. One popular name you might be called is bigot. However, the definition of bigot is a person who strongly and unfairly dislikes other people, ideas, etc. So anyone who calls you a bigot bears the burden of proof to explain how you unfairly dislike someone's idea. But they don't do that. They usually just throw out the term bigot, as so many people do nowadays as they play their victim card. On the other hand, perhaps you might be called intolerant. But in order to do that, they have to redefine tolerance. Tolerance is when I believe one thing and you believe another thing, and we both put up with each other. I don't tolerate people I agree with. I agree with them. I tolerate people I don't agree with. So when they call you intolerant, really they are just displaying their intolerance of your differing opinion, which you have the right to hold when you live in a country with freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and expression. Therefore, if they don't believe what we believe, and their response is just ad hominem attacks, that displays their intolerance of us, not vice versa. Some people might call you a racist, but since Islam is a religion and not a race, this one doesn't even make sense. If they've already realized that, they'll probably just resort to calling you an Islamophobe. However, this results in even more problems for them. Because one, Islam is not a person, it is a religio-political system. Two, by calling you this, they are attempting to control your subjective opinions about a religion that you have the freedom to hold in a country where there's freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and expression. And three, a phobia is something that exists in your mind. So they cannot control what you are afraid of, just like they can't control what you hate or what you love. Therefore, passing a resolution against Islamophobia is unconstitutional, because it condemns freedom of thought. So what is the solution to all of this? And most importantly, what should you do? First, since a number of people seem to forget where the free speech zones are, I brought this highly detailed map with me. Remember that one person's freedom of speech can result in another person being offended. Therefore, the First Amendment grants you the right to offend people and to be offended. In fact, offensive speech is the only kind of speech that needs to be protected and defended. Why? Because no one is offended or complains about non-offensive speech when you say something that they like or agree with. Second, there are a number of people out there who just hate Muslims because they're Muslims. That's it. You're Muslim, then they hate them. But people need to realize that Muslims are human beings who are made in the image of God.
Right.
Which means that they have intrinsic value and intrinsic human rights. Unfortunately, several Muslims, and even people who have been perceived to be Muslims when they actually weren't, have been the victims of violent crimes due to other people's intolerance. And this is very unfortunate, heartbreaking, and unacceptable. In a different way, my good friend Joe Carey, who's with the Lord now, always said that all Muslims are victims because they're believing the lie of Islam. What we need to do is love Muslims, but be completely free to critique Islam. Why? We should love Muslims because they're not because they're Muslims, but simply because they're people made in the image of God who need the gospel. And we should be free to critique Islam because Islam is a religio-political system, a religion and a political ideology combined. Third, you need to get informed and help inform others. That includes sharing this presentation and the one on the Muslim Brotherhood and others with everyone you know. Also making sure that people are aware of the Muslim Brotherhood and as many front groups right here in America, and aware of which people in all different fields have actually been influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood and have ties with them. Fourth, continue to love your Muslim neighbors and co-workers and classmates. And know that a Muslim who loves American freedom and practices their religion peacefully, while in full, genuine support of the Constitution and Bill of Rights, is not who you should be most concerned about. Muslims and the Constitution can be compatible. Sharia and the Constitution cannot. Fifth, remember that many Muslims in America and throughout the world live peaceful lives, and they would not support this agenda if they found out about it. Are there moderate Muslims, using the Western definition of the word moderate? Yes, there are millions of them. But there is no moderate Islam. Why? Because your moderate or nominal Muslim friend, neighbor, co-worker, classmate, etc. doesn't define Islam. Muhammad defined it 1400 years ago. The primary and secondary sources that I showed you earlier are more widely available today than ever before. And reading those sources is causing many Muslims to leave Islam, especially when they find out what those sources say about Muhammad and the spread of Islam, especially between the 7th and 10th centuries AD. Sixth, remember that Islam is a religio-political system, a religion and a political ideology combined. However, the religion is the base of the system. So the politics don't influence the religion influences the politics. What all people need to realize is that since the foundation of the system is a religious one, at the end of the day, this is primarily a spiritual issue. Yeah. So it's not a political issue, and a political solution will not last in the long term. A spiritual problem requires a spiritual solution. So what do we have to offer? The gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. In the New Testament, we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 that Jesus Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, then to his 12 disciples, and he appeared to more than 500 people at one time. Historical and archaeological evidence are just two of the things that set Christianity apart from all the man-made religions out there, one of which is Islam. Unlike all of the man-made religions, Christianity is a reasonable faith based on evidence. So the gospel needs to be shared with everyone, and everyone includes all Muslims. God commands all people everywhere to repent and put their trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. When we do that, God forgives our sins and grants us the gift of everlasting life. And some people say, I'm not a Christian, I'm just an American. That's fine. Like other Americans, you probably have realized the truthfulness of Ronald Reagan's statement when he said, if we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. If you're an American who loves American freedom, this is an issue for you, because this topic has to do with national security, American freedom, and the documents which our country was founded upon. And the success or failure of this plan will determine the future of the America that your children and grandchildren will live in. Ronald Reagan also said, freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to our children to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States, where men were free. God bless you, and God bless America.